All right, well listen, thank you all for coming today. It's going to be a presentation on a more fair monetary system for Ireland. First slide you see here is what world do we want for them. So it's about the kind of system that we could create for ourselves and for our children. It's social credit for Ireland. I'm going to use the term social credit interchangeably with the term that I use more often, which is fair money. So the idea is that a more fair monetary system, as if people mattered. So there's two problems that I'm going to be talking about today. The first one is the shortage of spending power in the economy, and anybody in Ireland today would instantly understand what that means, because we have all sorts of products and services available in the country, but the spending power isn't there, so people aren't able to buy them. And the other problem is that private corporations have taken over our money supply, and of course these two problems are interrelated, as you're going to see. So the first one is the shortage of spending power. It can happen actually at the best of times because the total paid out in wages and profits is not sufficient to meet all the costs of production. Therefore, somehow or other extra money needs to be introduced into the economy. The question is how that gets done. And so that's actually the second problem, because this is how money is actually introduced into the economy. And it's actually introduced as debt-based money. So we have a group of persons known as the financial sector, and they've taken control of the money supply. They run it as a monopoly. So therefore, almost all money in circulation is created by the financial sector out of thin air as loans with debt accruing. So let's now see the biggest problem of all, which in everything to do with money, this is the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is interest payments. Because, as you can see here, all the debt-based money, it must be paid back to the financial sector. Now, it could work in theory, except that the debt must be repaid plus interest. The interest is not created at the time of the issue of the loan and is never created. Therefore, we end up scrambling to repay loans plus interest that was never created. And the interest is a black hole that forces individuals and countries into bankruptcy. This is the core essence of what I'm talking about, as this is the problem, this is what we need to fix. And everything that everyone else is talking about is, in my opinion, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And people are getting themselves all kind of caught up in all sorts of different details of what's actually happening in the economy, when this is what's happening. There's money is created out of thin air as loans. The interest is never created. Therefore, you can show this to a child on the back of an envelope and they'll understand it. If we create 100 and there's only 100 in existence, but we have to repay 200, well, that's a problem. So here's a nice graphic that shows that interest is actually a black hole in the economy. So you see here the different sectors of our economy. We've got consumers, retailers, the production and distribution sector, and labour. So you can break down the economy of all the people in the economy into these sectors, if you like. Now you can actually see in one direction there's the money is flowing. So the money is flowing from the households, from the consumers. They're spending with the retailers. The retailers are paying the producers. The producers are paying the employees who are putting the money back into the household. So you have money circulating, and then in the opposite direction to the money, goods and services are moving. So the goods are coming from the production industry, they go to the retail stores who sell them on to the consumers. The consumers, by using these goods, they keep themselves healthy and fit and strong, and so then they're able to use their expertise as labour to go work in industry. So that therefore you have in the opposite direction to the money, goods and services are flowing, and money, by the way, is only a token system, which is an invention of humanity to make it easier for us to exchange goods and services. That's all that money is. It's an invention of humanity, and it's a very useful invention, because otherwise we have to barter, and barter is very cumbersome. So money is simply a token system that we use to achieve that. Unfortunately, you find that there's a black hole in the middle of our economy where interest payments are going, which is sucking out our wealth on a constant basis and causing chaos in our dealings as human beings at every level. So the end result is what's called debt slavery. So debt slavery means there's thin air money, with the obligation to repay non-existent interest, that results in debt slavery, and that's the situation. This, what we live in, is a sophisticated form of slavery, but it is slavery, and we need to wake up to that and admit to ourselves that we are actually debt slaves before we're going to be able to do anything about it. So therefore you find that the real wealth of the people in the nation is put up as collateral for loans issued by the financial sector. The interest is never created but must be paid back, so more and more loans go into default. Defaulting loans suck the real wealth of the individual and the nation into the arms of the financial sector. So what we have here is a massive transfer of wealth, and here's a historical note. A few hundred years ago the financial sector owned few properties. Now the financial sector owns about 50% of the property of Ireland via mortgages, and it's the same all over the world. The financial sector already owns about half of this planet, because if you look at any property on this planet, or any car, or any significant piece of property, there's a mortgage or a loan on it, and that the banks have the deeds, the banks have the lien on that property. They can foreclose and seize that actual tangible wealth. And bear in mind, money's only a token system, so by gaining a monopoly on the token system, they've gained control on the wealth and actual ownership of the wealth. Now they're coming for our country because they've got all the property and mortgages, and now they're coming for the national wealth as well. So this is debt, deflation and poverty. I'm just going to go through this graphic. I know it might look a little bit crazy, but just to show you, you've got the sectors in the economy: households, government and firms, which are, you could say, the productive sectors of the economy. But there's also the financial sector, which has taken over control of the money supply. Now, here you will see debt payments flowing from industry, and from the government, and from households. Debt payments. And remember that we're paying principal plus interest. The financial sector is only, if they're loaning out at all, they would be loaning out principal, but we're always paying principal plus interest. So that means a constant deflation. That's a deflation, that's a fall in the money supply.
There's a laser on top of that column, we use a pointer.
Yeah. Oh, great. Okay. So, but what's actually happening, not only is there deflation being caused just by the mathematics of having to pay back more money than money that's actually issued, the financial sector are up to all sorts of shenanigans by sending the money out to other countries and hoarding the money, so that, and you see the dotted line, that's domestic investment that's actually not even happening. So that's why anybody who wants to set up a business now, they can't, because they can't get any money to set up the business. They can't get loans from the financial sector. So it's even worse than it could be. So now I just want to talk a little bit about social credit, which is the ideas that are underpinning what I'm doing. I don't actually, I speak about what I'm proposing as fair money, because although it's based on the ideas of social credit, I don't slavishly follow every proposal that might be associated with that term, so therefore I use the term of fair money. But I would like to speak about social credit as the underpinning idea. So it was coined by a man called C.H. Douglas, and he believed that humanity had proprietary rights over all of the know-how contributed by ancestors, and this entitles every individual to a dividend payment called social credit. So in other words, the reason we're able to produce so much is because we've got things like the wheel and metals and glass and things that were all invented millennia ago by our ancestors. But that means that as a society we're able to produce a lot of goods that makes our lives better and more enriched, and it is actually the wealth of humanity. And therefore money would only be the token system which would allow us to trade that wealth. And therefore money should, everyone has a right to get sufficient money so that the wealth of the nation can be sufficiently traded. And therefore under a system like social credit or fair money, there will be enough money in circulation to buy all the goods and services at any particular time. unlike the situation we have at the moment where there's deflation, there's a lack of money supply, so the goods and services can't be bought. You ask any self-employed person or a retailer in Ireland today, is there enough money in Ireland? And they'll tell you for sure there isn't enough money in circulation. So the idea of a national fiat treasury money being introduced to the economy is not debt financed bank loans, but fresh purchasing power that originates in the hands of consumers. Provides an answer to depressions caused by a shortage of purchasing power, of hiring power and debt paying power. So there's a shortage of purchasing power, also hiring power and debt paying power, and that can be fixed by having a fiat currency which is issued directly to the households. And the key here is the money is issued directly to the people. It's not issued to the banks, it's not issued to the government, it's issued to the people. It replaces our present form of money. It's money at the moment is introduced as bank loans to the different sectors. So we would still have a market system, but its consumer demand, supplemented by social credit, would make abundant domestic production profitable. And that would eliminate deflation. And deflation or collapse in the money supply is what causes economic depression. So money will continue to circulate. Money that originates at low credit must be paid back, dragging interest with it. But social credit will be thin air fiat money which the government will authorise. And as I mentioned, it's originating in the household sector. And that will give us a very prosperous economy. So here it is in a graphic. It's similar to the graphic you saw before, but instead of a black hole in the middle of the economy, we would have a national credit office which would issue dividend to each and every, I would propose each and every adult in the economy would get this dividend. That supplements the spending power, so there's enough wages plus dividends to go to the retailer and purchase the goods in the society. I'm not going to spend too much time on this graphic here, but it's just showing you how everything is unbalanced in our economy. For instance, the government sector is unbalanced because there's not enough taxation coming in for government spending. And therefore government actually borrows from the financial sector, which is exactly what the financial sector want. They want government debt because then they basically enslave the entire population through the national debt, because the government then has to go out and pay and collect taxes to repay the national debt. So that's all totally unbalanced. Foreign trade is unbalanced because there's money being borrowed to buy imports without balancing that with exports. Households, of course, and firms are also in debt from money being loaned from the financial sector. So here's a balanced fair money or social credit system. The financial sector will be balanced. It will be full reserve, 100% reserve requirement for banks to make any kind of loans whatsoever. Government sector will be balanced. There'll be plenty of money in circulation, and there'll be plenty of economic activity, unlike what we have now. So therefore, the government will be able to collect a very reasonable amount of taxation, which you could and therefore balance that with spending. The same thing with the foreign sector, which you balance your imports and exports. So it's a system of balance with enough money in circulation via the national dividend. Now, it's important to understand that there are two worlds. There's an upper loop and a lower loop. Most of us are in this lower loop, where in order to survive, we take loans from the financial sector, which issues a certain amount of money. But look, principal plus interest, it always comes back to interest. There's more money being taken out of the economy than there is being put into the economy. Now, it's very interesting that conventional economists will explain that this isn't a problem because all the extra money collected as interest is just profit for the banks, and the nice banking people will redistribute that money back into the economy in the form of wages and dividends and other spending of the banks, which will keep everything in balance. But that's not at all what happens, because there are trillions and trillions of euros and dollars sloshing around in bailout funds, and none of that money is around available for spending. So where is the money going, or what's going on? Well, here's what actually happens. In America, you've got a central bank called the Federal Reserve, but it'll be very similar with the European Central Bank. So they have what's called the discount window, where the money goes out for retail lending, and that's a little drip feeder. So very, very small amounts of money come out into the actual household, government or production sector via this type of lending. But what happens is vast amounts of money go to what's called the upper loop, who are the controllers of the financial sector. So they're scooping up the money that's coming from the interest payments, and they're scooping up any money that's coming from the so-called bailout funds. It's all going up to this upper loop, and they're basically buying up the world with it. So in other words, long story short, the bondholders who are in the upper loop, who we're struggling so hard to pay back the bondholders of the Irish banks, these same people will now come back and buy Ireland in a fire sale. So they'll be the ones who are going to buy the forests, and they'll buy up the airports when they're sold off, and they'll buy up the electrical company when bits of it are sold off. So all the things that our ancestors built up as our social credit will now be sold off to our slave masters, in other words. Now, this is why the upper loop loves a deflationary depression, because they have a bargain bonanza, which is the point that I just made. They pretend they don't like it, but they get loads of money out of the financial sector, which they hoard. And when there's a deflation, the value of money goes up, which you can probably, anybody who's got a property can understand that less money buys more property in Ireland today, because all the houses that might have been worth 500,000 are selling for 250,000. Now that's an irrelevant point for most Irish people, because they can't get their hands on any money. They can't get a loan even if they wanted it, or else they've lost their jobs. They don't have the money. But for the upper loop who have the money, who are getting the bailout money, they can now come into Ireland as investors and buy up Irish property and rent it out back to the Irish people. So that's another step in the enslavement. Important point about how Ireland got robbed by the euro. Basically, the Irish economy was kept somewhat in check up to the point where we bought the euro, because the Irish banks could only multiply their loans based on the amount of money in circulation in the Irish economy and in the amount of deposits that they had. Now, it's a big multiplier. They might have been multiplying it 10 times, so the money supply was expanding through more and more bank loans. But there was some little bit of a check on it because of exchange rate risk. In other words, people holding Deutschmarks wouldn't get involved in loaning into the Irish economy, because if there was an exchange rate fluctuation, they could lose their profits. So the Irish market was running on punts for loans. But as soon as we bought the euros, as soon as we became part of the euro, the Irish banks were able to go to the Frankfurt Money Exchange and sell their bonds on the Frankfurt Money Exchange in euros. So this is where the bondholders actually came from that we keep hearing about. They were now dealing in euros, and they saw Ireland as pretty good. That is a good running economy. It's a good low risk investment. So they made that investment in Ireland. It was a bad call, but then we ended up, the Irish people, taking on the debt. And there's a nice graphic on it. It's a reversal of the Dickens story. Please, sir, can I have some more? But actually, it's the big fat man who's getting off the starving kid, and that's us. So it's just more and more money and wealth being sucked out of us to keep the super wealthy bondholders with more wealth. This is a graphic here of the extent of Ireland's debt. Just look how big it is. This is in euros, it's not in percentages. And the actual amount of the debt is way bigger than Spain, which is a far bigger economy, and it's much bigger than Italy, which is a far bigger economy. Now, there's household debt, which is bigger than anyone else has got. There's non-financial corporations, which is bigger than anyone else has got. Financial corporations, which is this massive, what is it, 259? Look at this huge amount compared to what other countries have. Massive amount of financial debt that we got suckered into taking on, and then there's government debt. Now, the interesting thing is that all the austerity moves are to do with this small amount of actual government debt, which is run up with government overspending. So it's tiny compared to the total debt, but this is all of our austerity measures are to do with that, which is, compared to everything else that's going on, is fairly irrelevant. 663 billion is our total debt. Now, if you work it out, the interest is 33 billion a year at 5%. The national income of Ireland is only 117 billion. So I think that's all the money, all the income in Ireland combined, government, private, corporate, everything amounts to 117 billion. Now, if all the money made in Ireland in a year is that, you can't turn around and pay 33 billion in just interest alone. It's just not there. I mean, that money, the 117 billion is being spent on food and other things. There isn't an extra 33 billion, but it's just a very glaring example of how insane our money system is. I worked it out. It's 663,000 million euros is the debt. That works out as 165,750 euros in debt per man, woman and child. So, I mean, you work that out if it's a family of 4 or 5. It must be, what is it, 3 million? Something like 300 or 9, almost a million. If it's a family of 4 or 5, it's a million or more. And the government is just tinkering around with a 20 billion euro annual budget deficit, which is, again, it's rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. That's what that is. Here's just from an Irish point of view, the sectors: the household, government, production, and the financial sector over here with our good friends, the Irish banks, which we were coerced into bailing out, or our government was coerced into bailing out. So this is the money that comes, and there's the money that's owed, but it's principal plus interest. We get the principal, we have to pay back principal plus interest. Any child can understand that can't work. The interest drain causes a deflationary spiral. And it's really interesting, we're in a deflationary spiral. You can start anywhere you want. Let's start with falling demand. You ask, I say, any retailer, any self-employed person, is there falling demand? There sure as hell is falling demand. Nobody's buying much of anything. That turns into business losses. That turns into falling prices, which turns into layoffs and wage reductions. And that causes debt defaults. People can't pay their loans anymore, and bankruptcies of businesses and personal bankruptcies, which in turn turns into falling tax revenues, which is a huge problem at the moment. And an increased real debt burden. You see, that we owe the same amount of debt and the same amount of interest, but if we've got falling incomes, the real debt burden is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So that's why the austerity measures now are exactly the wrong thing, because everybody's cutting. The banks are cutting their loaning, households are cutting their spending, government is cutting their spending, and businesses can't pay as much tax. Government is paying less out to households in the form of whatever it might be, social security or child benefit or anything like that, and households are spending less with government because they don't have the taxes to pay. But we still have the same amount of principal and interest owing on all these loans, so the amount of the debt burden is bigger and bigger. That's the interest drain as well. And again, just to remind you, the interest drain is constantly in the background there, plundering our wealth. Here's the alternative. Instead of having a black hole in the middle of the economy, you actually have a thin air intake into the National Credit Office, which is pumping out the required money and spending power to the households, not to the government, not to industry, not to the banks, to the households to spend as they see fit, spend that money at the retailers, and then that money goes to industry. It's a very simple system, but one that can work. So I've got an outline then of what we can do for Ireland for a fair money or social credit strategy. So
just go back to that one, sorry, for a second.
That one?
Yeah, I just want to.
Yeah. So to create economic democracy and prosperity for us and our children. So the first point is a new currency. We could do it along the lines of the Guernsey pound, where they've got a currency that's like sterling, circulates in parity with sterling, and you can spend in Guernsey, you can spend Guernsey pounds or sterling pounds, but it's their own currency. It's not actually usable outside of Guernsey, but it can be used in Guernsey, and they're a very, very wealthy country with low taxation as a result. So that's similar. Switzerland has some form of another currency as well. Another alternative is to break entirely from the euro and use our strong exports to fund our required imports, like necessities like food and oil. So the way to make the currency work is that if the government accepts it in payment of tax obligations, it will become an instant success. If we issue our own currency as new punts or fair punts, whatever we might want to call them, if we mandate the government to accept that in payment of tax obligations, then everybody's going to be very happy to use that money. So that's a good way to get things started. The advantage of our new currency is that you will get a check every month, and everybody will get a check every month. It's your spending which will then distribute that money, and the argument is that consumers are in the best position to make the wisest choices about how to distribute the money to the most efficient producers. So your spending will actually lift the economy. Now, just about deflation, inflation, and balance. People are always going on about inflation and the risk of inflation, but we're actually in a deflationary depression. So it's an absolute disaster of deflation that we've got now. But inflation can also be avoided by issuing sufficient but not excessive amounts of currency, and that's something that will be done on a trial and error basis. But the one thing for sure is that we're an awful long way from inflation becoming a problem in this country, because it's deflation is the problem right now, and that's what's causing all the misery. There is actually no shortage of anything in this country. It's not like in 2006 we had everything we need and all of a sudden we don't have what we need to be wealthy and prosperous. The only thing that's in short supply is the money supply. That's all. So we just need to bring that back into balance. Now the money would have to obviously be legal tender. There may be some need to adjust for people, for companies buying in euros. You could discuss whether we have two currencies running in parallel. I would actually favour moving entirely to fair punts and using euros for foreign trade, because Ireland actually is in a very strong position. We have actually a lot of companies exporting in Ireland, so there's enough euros coming into the country to pay for those exports that will be enough to cover the euros we need to pay for imports. So, just a little something there from Dick Eastman. The punt is a measure of purchasing power, like the meter is a measure of distance. We shouldn't let foreign bankers force us to use their measure and charge us for us. We can make our own measure and not charge money to have it and use it. And it should be issued free and clear to the people in the country. And it's a very hard concept to get around. It's like some people say, well, that's getting something for nothing. But it's actually not. It's just introducing sufficient money. And some people say, well, we need, that's just fiat currency. That's the whole problem we have today. And I'm saying, no, it's not the problem. Money is always a token system, even if it's so-called backed with gold or something else. It's simply just a token system. It represents a token of wealth, and it's used for wealth exchange. That's all. It's all it ever will be. So there's nothing actually wrong with fiat currency. But a fiat currency that's issued by the banking sector, where they have the power to create that money out of thin air and charge interest, which they never create, that's what the problem is, and that's the historical fraud that's been visited upon us. End the national debt. We end all government borrowing and end all government and bank bailout payments immediately, pending renegotiation. Governments, as a principle, governments should never borrow, and especially not from banks charging interest. And the simple way to do it is you balance government spending against tax receipts, and it's just simple mathematics. Is whatever the government collects, they should make a budget of what they collected last year and say, well, that's what we're going to spend in the following year. The transition may involve some borrowing from the National Credit Office, so instead of perhaps some of the money all of it going to households, the government may need to borrow some, but that would have to be a very, very transitional movement. In general, the National Credit or the fair money goes directly to households. I would also propose that we stop giving away our natural resources in Ireland. If you get oil from Norway, you've got to give them 50%. If you get oil from Ireland, you get it for nothing. So I would propose that we would regard all those agreements as fraudulent. Just another graphic here saying why should we be paying for interest on basically paper tokens that should be free. And it's just insane that we're actually giving up our future and the future of our children for something that is actually just a simple fraud that's there to enslave us and our children. Dealing with the EU and the IMF is an interesting question, because ever since this began, there's been the scare tactic has been used of no money in the ATMs, and that was the scare tactic that was used to take Brian Cowan and Brian Lenihan into a room one night back in 2008 and tell them that if you don't guarantee the debts of all the banks in Ireland, there'll be no money in the ATMs tomorrow. And that's the same appalling vista that's presented to us by the EU and the IMF, that if we don't play the ball and we don't keep cutting and slashing, and now the next step start throwing people out of their homes at the behest of the EU and the IMF, well then there'll be no money in the ATMs. Well, that's okay if we're begging them for euros, but what about if we create our own currency and we put our own money in the ATMs? That's my suggestion. Then they might be outraged, but their power over us will be a lot less. An end to mortgage misery. I would suggest paying mortgages only on an interest. No more interest to be paid on mortgages, because that's a total fraud, and to pay them only on a principal only basis, and then to renegotiate the whole system. There are different people who would argue that the actual amount of money that banks loan out is even a fraction of the amount of principal that they loan, because they're using a multiplier. So that would have to be worked out as to what would be a fair way to extinguish all of these loans, which are in essence a fraud, because they're all based on the idea of banks loaning out money that they don't have and never have had, and therefore they're not really incurring any risk, but they're pretending they're incurring a risk, and they're charging interest, so-called interest, for this risk, but they're not creating the interest, so it's actually impossible to pay back the loans. It is simply just a gigantic fraud, and that has to end. One solution for mortgages is the beauty of just paying back the principal only is that people who have, under this transitional system, people who have a house and have taken a loan on it will still be liable to pay back that loan. So therefore people who have rented or have taken a very small loan won't feel hard done by that someone's getting a free house. That's not going to happen. People will still have a loan to repay. So that seems to be fair. As to exactly how we work out the detail of the exact amount to be paid back per euro borrowed will have to be looked at. National debt is risen due to a fraudulent financial kleptocracy. A kleptocracy is ruled by thieves. And this really is organised crime, with all the ugliness that goes with it. I would suggest that the Irish national debt is to be put on hold, and certainly no interest is to be paid whatsoever, because the interest doesn't exist. So how can you be asked to pay back something that doesn't exist? And then the rest will have to be dealt with by negotiation. But under this principle I'm talking about, would be putting people first. I'm also suggesting that this direct democracy on the political front really can only work and is the most meaningful when you have economic democracy as well, and the two, I would suggest, go hand in hand. The reason we're in this mess is because we've abdicated our responsibility, and we've been behaving like children with some adults in the form of the financial sector who are supposedly going to look after us, and the same attitude towards government that, well, the government should look after it. But this is actually the definition of what was in ancient Greece known as an idiot. An idiot was a person who did not engage in what's actually going on in their lives, especially in the political sense and economic sense, and that's where the word idiot comes from. So we've been idiots, and it's up to us to now take back control of our lives, political and economic. So here's what we can do. We could individually, first of all, admit that we have been debt slaves and repudiate fraudulent debt, even at least intellectually, to understand that these debts are fraudulent. We should also speak out and inform others, and don't just allow people to talk in slave talk. We're all enslaved, and we're all programmed to accept our slavery. But it's time to at least realise that we've got chains on us, and that these chains are in the form of debt and interest payments, and we should recognise that, and not just allow people to say things like, oh well, we all went crazy borrowing money and everybody lost the run of themselves, and we shouldn't allow comments like that to pass. We should make the point that we're debt slaves, and that this is a sophisticated slavery system that we need to wake up to. And locally, I would suggest creating local currencies, which is kind of a de facto way of getting away from a debt-based money system. Debt-free, interest-free money, and street co-ops. Nationally, we can put pressure on government to introduce debt-free, interest-free money at a national level, and to repudiate the national debt fraud. What's a street co-op, you might be asking? Well, everyone lives on a street, or at least a road, or a block of apartments. So each one of those could be a community and a basis for local action to create fair money. A street co-op would be open for everyone to join. It can share ideas on expertise for residents to grow food, I would say especially. So then food, services and other items can be traded on the street using debt-free, interest-free street money. So you'd actually create your own local currency, and I've been talking to James and other people about this, about linking these street co-ops, because if every street denominated their own little local currency in euros, then trade could occur between streets. You could start linking them all together. I have spoken to people on my street, and there's great interest in the idea. I haven't shown them this presentation, but I've talked to them about a street co-op for people to grow food and exchange expertise, and maybe even one person could specialise in tomatoes, and another person would grow carrots, and you get a little bit of specialisation, and then trade coming after that. Plus, think about it, every street there's so many people who are self-employed who are not able to trade because the lack of euros, so they could trade on the street. And we could get back to that with the debt-free, interest-free money. And also everybody's got things in their garage and in their shed that they'd like to sell off. So why not just sell them on the street? And then the garden fork you don't want, you could sell to the person who's got a bicycle that they don't want. How long would it take? I think all of this could be implemented in a matter of a few months. The euro was introduced pretty quickly, it didn't seem to take a long time. So we could introduce our own currency if there's sufficient support. But really, the big factor that's in the way is X Factor and similar entertainments, because people are they're like rabbits caught in the headlights. They're sitting real still and just hoping that the threat will go away. But unfortunately, the threat isn't going to go away, and ignoring it is going to only make it worse. But we've got a whole media industry there to fill our minds full of rubbish with X Factor and other types of entertainment, and manipulated news, which is used to emotionally manipulate us to look at the latest school shooting or something like that, and not actually realise what the real elephant in the room is. And I would say the elephant in the room is interest payments and the theft that is representative of. So in the next year we have a choice. We can pay another 33 billion euros in interest payments and be even further in debt, with our children being even more enslaved than we are, or else we can create our own currency and lead the world in a move to fair money and fair play. These are the contacts. You can contact, you can look up Free Money Ireland on Facebook. You can contact me, I'm Cathal Spelman. It's Cathal at realhealthylifestyle.com, because that's my day job. I teach healthy lifestyle. My mobile number is 085 125 4296. We really do need to act, and act now. I would say there's never a better time than now. And as I say, it's all about our children and a better world for them. So that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.